Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My name is Ross Emmett, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at Arizona State University. Welcome to another lecture in the series Perspectives on Economic Liberty, hosted by the Center. The Perspectives series emerges from the Center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways to fulfill that mission is to invite a variety of guests who will interrogate our center's topic by revisiting old debates over the role of economic liberty in human betterment, evaluate economic liberty's contribution to human betterment, and for good or ill, and to consider its relationship to other human values and freedoms that we may hold. Our guest today is Dr. Eric Schliesser, professor of political science at the University of Amsterdam. I first met Eric, I'm pretty sure, when, in fact, I know this part is true, while he was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and I was starting my career as a professor in Western Canada. I don't remember, and we were talking earlier, and we're not exactly sure we remember exactly what the occasion was, although I suspect that it was a conference at George Mason or a seminar at Chicago. But I do remember in the course of the few comments that were being made and that Eric made, he linked to get the topic of our discussion to, very quickly, to Adam Smith, Isaac Newton, and Baruch Spinoza. The discussion, I was impressed. Okay. Not many people doing history of economics even know who Spinoza at least is. The discussion also laid the seed for his eventual work on Milton Friedman and Chile, which I had the fortune of publishing a portion of in a volume I edited on Chicago economics. And more recently, we have maintained contact online. Given our distance, he lives in London and works in Amsterdam, and I'm here in the western part of the United States, through his daily writing on his blog, Digressions and Impressions. Just to give you a sense of his current thinking, over the past week, he has posted on Ken Arrow's attempts to displace Knightian uncertainty, Judith Sklar and Adam Smith on politicians. I'm suspecting that might have something to do with today's talk. Vernon Smith and the replication crisis. If you don't know what that is, you should. And Pufendorf on property. Okay. So, and needless to say, Eric has a wide range of interests. 2 years ago, I asked Eric to speak to a class of mine at my former institution via Skype about a topic in Adam Smith's work. The seminar I was teaching was a reading of Adam Smith's work, and I had several people Skype in to speak on topics I thought that were appropriate to the course. However, when I turned the class over to Eric, he immediately informed the class that they could choose between having him speak on my topic, which he implied was extremely boring, okay, or on a new topic that he was really interested in and had miraculously created a whole set of slides for, Adam Smith on statesmanship. The class unanimously chose today's topic, and I learned my lesson. Never stand between Eric Schliesser and a topic he starts to think about. You're going to get run over. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Schliesser to ASU.
Testing? Perfect. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, Ross. I didn't realize how pushy and name-dropping I could be. But I'm really delighted by the invitation, and I want to thank the Center for inviting me. And also, if I run off during the talk, it's nothing you did, but I just want to steal that Wealth of Nation edition, and I'm just going to take the whole class thing with me. So if you have a chance or if you get bored during the lecture, just go look at it. It's really an amazing, amazing edition. And it also has some of my favorite passages. This lecture indeed started off 2 years ago as a first thought on it. Now you suddenly can hear me. At the time, I was writing the book that you see advertised, and this topic is not really addressed in the book, but is a kind of follow-up, and let's see where it goes. So I want to spend a minute or two talking about why look at leadership from the perspective of political philosophy and political economy. Then I'll say 2-3 minutes, it's just one slide, about Adam Smith's life and works. His life is very boring, so we can do that very quickly. Then I'll really get to the paper, and I'll introduce it through this philosopher, Judith Sklar, who Ross briefly mentioned, because she offers an interpretation of Smith that is very, very common, and also would entail that Smith has nothing to say on leadership. And so that's kind of the puzzle. And then I'll show you that the common view of Smith on leadership is wrong. He has actually quite a bit to say about it, much more than I realized even 2 years ago. He has most things to say about bad kind of leaders. And I'll give you typography of 3 kinds of bad leaders. And you might, and I think he says so much about bad leaders that you might come away thinking he only thinks there are bad leaders. But that's a mistake. And I will say something about what he thinks a good leader is. That turns out to be not super exciting, because that's actually the kind of reasonable things you might expect somebody to say who cares for other people and thinks we should do good in the world. But it'd be nice to see it combined. And then if there's time, but you might be bored by me, then I'll say something about the upshot of what I think is underneath the account I've given today. But I have about 40 minutes, I believe, and I'm not sure I'll get there. Okay, so why talk about leadership today at all? There's schools of leadership. It's a hot topic, especially in the business world and psychology. But in contemporary political philosophy, it's not really the center of attention. What philosophers and political theorists focus on is our procedures, on deliberation, on institutions, on emancipation, very important, on the rule of law, on justice, migration. There are all these very urgent topics and approaches, and leadership's really not on the agenda for most of them. And that's kind of intuitive, because much research today has a commitment to equality, sometimes substantive and economic equality, sometimes more procedural or formal. There's an interest in impartiality and in dignity, mutual respect, avoiding of harm. These are really standard tropes and topics in political theory today. And leadership doesn't fit in there. And there's a good reason for that, because leadership has been appropriated in the 20th century by fascists and people who like authority. And it's very hard to square that, you might think, with commitment to equality and mutual respect. So there's a sense that if you are liberal, whether the American left-wing liberal or more a classical or skeptical liberal, that you stay away from leadership, and you're going to talk about markets and about spontaneous order or about equality, but you're going to stay away from it. But the problem is that whether you're left-wing or right-wing liberal, laws, governments, and institutions, they're all run and maintained by people. They don't do it themselves. It's imperfect, human beings do it. And so we need a means of selecting the right kind of people and an understanding of what they must do. And some of them means the people coordinating it or guiding it from the top. I'm not going to give you a definition of leadership. I'm also today not at all going to talk about how we select the right people, which is a very important and complicated topic. The reason for that is that Smith himself, while not uninterested in parliamentary democracy and not uninterested in republicanism, actually has very little to say about selection of leaders. So I just don't think he has much to say. But he has quite a bit to say, it turns out, on what leadership is like and what its traits are. And that's what I'm going to spell out for you. And I'm also going to try to connect implicitly to some hot topics in contemporary political life without ever mentioning any names of living people. Okay, so this is Adam Smith. He has a beautiful wig. Lived an unbelievably boring life. A good chunk of it he lived with his mom, who died when she was 90. That tells you how uneventful it was. He was a bachelor. He was probably one of the nerdiest people in Scotland in his youth. Went to Oxford on a fellowship to become a minister. Then decided that wasn't for him. Through the patronage system in Scotland, got brought back to Edinburgh, started lecturing, and very quickly to the public, and then very quickly got a job at Glasgow without having published anything. Those were the days. University of Glasgow, however, was an up-and-coming university, one of the really true intellectual centers of the 18th century, and he started teaching on a whole bunch of topics, and fairly quickly then published his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, now again really in focus among moral psychologists and moral philosophers. It's really studied again, but for a long time it was overshadowed by its more famous book, The Wealth of Nations. Both books went through multiple editions in his lifetime, and Smith was the kind of person who couldn't let it go, and he would make constant alterations to the books. So people like me are in business because we have to figure out, is it first edition, sixth edition? He died in 1790, and on his deathbed, he burnt most of his papers. 24 volumes. Act of great concealment, but he made sure that a number of essays were spared. Those essays were published by his friends Hutton and Black. If you know your geology and chemistry, they're famous names. And that's essays on philosophical subjects. Part of my intellectual career has been is to figure out how the three books hang together, and my book is trying to explain that. Let me see if I skipped anything from memory. Oh yeah, an important thing is that he left the Glasgow University in 1764. He got basically a big pot of money if he was going to be a tutor to the richest man in England, the Duke of Buccleuch. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Unfortunately for Smith, so they went to France, did a grand tour, met all the famous intellectuals there, and then the student dies. So that trip got cut short. They go back to England, and Smith goes to his mom and writes The Wealth of Nations. It's really that exciting. He has great friends, so his correspondence is very interesting, but his life itself is botany and economics, and his mom. After The Wealth of Nations comes out, he accepts a job as a commissioner of customs, so basically a tax inspector. Which is kind of interesting if you think about his reputation. And the last years of his life, he was a very active commissioner of the customs. He also wrote this little book called The Life of Hume, which is a defense of his friend David Hume, who was the most famous atheist of the period. And it got Smith into a lot of trouble because people thought he was perhaps a bit too charitable to the great atheist. And that made people suspect his views on religion himself. Yeah, that's it. No lover, no children, no sublimated homoeroticism. It's really, that's it. It would make for a bad movie. Okay, how much time do I have left, Ross? Lots, perfect. Okay, so this is a really cool thinker, Judith Sklar. She died a while ago, Harvard political theorist. I'm using her today as a foil, but I really want you to know I respect her amazingly. So I think she's a very interesting character, and the fact that she gets Smith, I think, really wrong tells you something about the intellectual milieu of the 20th century. if in Q&A you want me to say more about that, I'd be happy to do so. So this is from her book, After Utopia, The Decline of Political Faith. With the exception of monopolists, Adam Smith spoke of no one with greater contempt than of politicians. Beneath this accusation lies the common anarchism of the Enlightenment, which essentially amounts to the belief that society is inherently good, but that governments, and they alone, prevent it from flourishing. If you're around contemporary libertarians, something like this is still the common faith, right? And so the part of the interest here is that this claim of Schliesser's right is kind of the shared religious belief of the Enlightenment more generally, right? And it's not a silly reading of Adam Smith at all. I'm going to give you some evidence to support it, but as you can imagine, second half of the lecture, I'm going to say there's something also really wrong about this. Actually, pretty soon I'll say that. Okay, so you're the standard reading of Adam Smith, and also I could have mentioned all kinds of very good scholars, Joseph Crafty, Donald Winch. There are quite a few other people who've said stuff like this. So she's not being idiosyncratic. So this is standard reading of Adam Smith, that society is naturally good or harmonious. You may have heard that. That government is the source of corruption of society and of individuals. Given that the government's under control of the politicians, so the politicians are really the source of corruption, right? So that's all fairly... And so you might even think, as she suggested, anarchism, or in Smith's terminology, the system of natural liberty, really is preferable and a right way to go. Is there a system of natural liberty quote on our thing? Well, we'll get to that in a second. Conceptually, the problem with this line of thought, and I'll give you that quote in a second, is that Smith thinks that anarchism, that even in anarchism, corruption would happen automatically. And that's very important. Let me give you the quote. The disposition to admire and almost to worship. Is there somebody from Scotland here? Because I'd love to have a voiceover do Adam Smith. Yeah, the other problem with Smith is he's fantastically quotable, but he's almost never funny, which I think is a problem. The disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and powerful, and to despise or at least to neglect persons of poor and mean condition, though necessary both to establish and to maintain the distinction of ranks and the order of society, is at the same time the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Our focus on billionaires undermines our morality. Right? That's Smith's claim. If you focus on the rich, you end up admiring celebrities. This is what we do all the time. You end up being corrupted morally. Right? But there's a second part to the claim, and that is because we do that, society is stable. Right? Because it gives deference to authority. Right? So on the one hand, there's an indignation about what we do naturally. On the other hand, there's a kind of utility to this because it makes society more stable and more cohesive, even though it produces bad moral outcomes. For my present purpose, the important point is that even a wholly anarchist society then would not be inherently good. Right? The standard picture cannot be right because standardly we are going to be constantly focusing on the wrong people. That's just who we are. Moreover, there's a more important problem with the view, and that is that Smith's depiction of anarchism is something to be overcome. For Smith, the state of anarchy, which he associates with North American Indians or with past hunter-gatherers, is a condition of poverty. And in virtue of that poverty and extreme famine, we end up doing really unconscionable things to each other. Right? So the project of the Great Wealth of Nations is to grow commerce and political civilization in order to make us better off economically and morally. I love that in the edition you have here, The Wealth of Nations, where he has his title, he calls himself formally the professor of moral philosophy. Right? For him, economics is a moral project. Having said that, I don't want you to come away immediately that the standard reading is silly. Smith is indeed very critical in the text of what he calls the insidious and crafty politician. This is not an admirable character. And moreover, Smith is indeed in favor of removing all the ways in which governments and feudal and clerical privileges control trade and movement and promote mercantile policies. And mercantile policies, which really just means growing at the expense of anybody else, on Smith's view, undermines morality and creates imperialism and slavery. Right? To put this very crassly, if you follow business interests abroad, you may end up doing very bad things abroad. That's Smith's view. If you want to have trade, you have to do it in a way such that both sides benefit. So you might actually think then, look, maybe he really does think that a politician of a good kind of state doesn't have to do much. Because if they do stuff, they end up mucking things up. There's a beautiful quote, I don't have it on my handout, of the statesman who is constantly superintending people. I think it's the book 4, chapter 2 quote. After the talk, you should take a look at it, where he says, when people are directing other people's affairs, they really do terrible things. Right? That is really Smith. So you might think that under ideal circumstances, indeed, Smith thinks the politician should do almost nothing. I'm going to get to the next slide in a second. I'm going to show that there's something to that, but it's not quite right either. But having said that, scholars know this already. Smith thinks that the state should do quite a bit. It should provide public goods, public health, care for defense, for education, and perhaps maybe even some redistribution. What that last point is controversial, but I defend it in the book. But let's look at Smith on trade disputes. This is the longest quote. Most of them I've managed to condense. Apologies for this. Okay, so this is in the context of debating whether it's good to put tariffs on other countries. Book is 200 and somewhat years old, but this topic hasn't gone away. To judge whether such retaliations, right, retaliatory tariffs, are likely to produce such an effect does not perhaps belong so much to the science of a legislator, whose deliberations ought to be governed by general principles which are always the same. I'll come back to that in a second. As to the skill of that insidious and crafty animal, vulgarly called a statesman or a politician, whose counsels are directed by the momentary fluctuation of affairs. When there's no probability that any such repeal can be procured, right? So if you're putting retaliatory tariffs in order to get the other side to back down on tariffs, but you suddenly discover this won't work, it seems a bad method of compensating the injury done to certain classes of our people to do another injury ourselves, not only to those classes, but to almost all the other classes of them. When our neighbors prohibit some manufacture of ours, we generally prohibit not only the same, for that alone would seldom affect them considerably, but some other manufacturers of theirs. Right? So when, say, China has a tariff on us, and we then want to do a retaliatory on China, we're not going to use the same business to do a tariff on. We're going to pick another business because it wouldn't hurt them otherwise. But that then ends up hurting our own. This may no doubt give encouragement to some particular class of workmen among ourselves, and by excluding some of their rivals may enable them to raise their price in the home market. Those workmen, however, who suffered by our neighbors' prohibition will not be benefited by ours. Even when we have good retaliatory tariffs, we end up not helping the people most in need. It's a key point for Smith. On the contrary, they and almost all the other classes of our citizens will thereby be obliged to pay dearer than before for certain goods. Tariffs raise prices. Every such law, therefore, imposes a real tax upon the whole country not in favor of that particular class of workmen who are injured by our neighbor's prohibition, but of some other class. Promise, not going to do more economics than this. So in the long quote, Smith is relying on the contrast between a politician and a true statesman. Crafty politicians are called statesmen by the people, but that's a mistake. That there is something like a true statesman who has the signs of the legislator. And it's indeed true that in the passage I just quoted, Smith is no fan of them, right? But it's not altogether negative, because the crafty politician has a skill. She's good at judging how other countries will react to our retaliatory tariffs, right? So that means that even the crafty politician that Smith dislikes has knowledge of human nature, understands something about the domestic politics of another country, and has some judgment about how likely they are to behave in ways we want. I'm not saying that Smith is endorsing the crafty politician, but he actually is more respectful of it than people seem, like Judith Sklar, seem to have noticed. Unfortunately, most of such political behavior is tactical, zero-sum, and because it's ignorant of true economics, namely Smith's system, it ends up being self-defeating, right? That's his claim in the thing, right? The retaliatory tariffs don't help the victims of foreign trade barriers, but rather the well-connected industries, and perhaps their workers. What he doesn't say, but what Smith's great student, Sophie de Grouchy, a French aristocrat, said, is that in fact there's a political further problem, and that is that the tariffs end up entrenching the politically well-connected, and they get more power at the expense of everybody else. So it's not just economics, it's also politics. Having said that, it seems then in non-ideal circumstances, even the crafty politicians that Smith doesn't like may have some purpose. If you're in an environment where everybody's doing retaliation, knowing people who know how to deal with that, having them in charge, can, for limited matter, do some good. It's not the approach he encourages, and he's very clear in the passages that follow that in general they end up mucking things up worse, but it's not altogether critical. Okay, what I'm really going to focus on in the remainder of the talk is about the true statesman and legislator who deliberates on general principles which are always the same. Right, so there's a knowledge that leaders can use and can use in political life. That's the claim that Smith has. What's important to recognize is that a principle is not a moral commitment. You know, we sometimes say that person is a woman of principle. Right, that's not what he means. He means it in the traditional sense that's a foundational cause. And a lot of books, textbooks in economics to this day are called principles of economics. That's that notion of principle. So the claim that I want to extract from the long quote that we discussed is that for Smith, a statesman ought to be guided by robust knowledge. And I'm going to develop that point in what follows. In one sense, that's not surprising. Smith is a card-carrying member of the Enlightenment, and for Enlightenment philosophers, knowledge is good. Right? So in that sense, there's really nothing surprising that he too would have thought that if you're going to be a politician or a statesman, you've got to be guided by knowledge. There's going to be more complications. The key point is in this other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, some general and even systematic idea of the perfection of policy and law may no doubt be necessary for directing the views of the statesman. In normal English, you need some vision to guide policy. And that vision needs to be systematic, so based on knowledge, and it needs to be coherent in some sense. And that means that rather than ad hoc tactical maneuvers, a true statesman is guided by a coherent vision that allows them to plan for many contingencies and over the longer term. Now, how that works is a long story, but the three key features. One that I'll give you evidence of in passing is that a true statesman is guided by a vision. It means for Smith that the best kind of politicians and statesmen are motivated by ambition, on the one hand, and beauty, which is going to be surprising. But the payoff of their ambition is good consequences for humanity. That's ideally what happens. The third claim I'm going to convince you of, and I'll give you some evidence of the second claim in a second. The third claim I'm going to mention is that even though the good political leader is guided by knowledge and almost, I wouldn't say utopian, but really big picture visions, is that they have to work with people's opinions, even if these opinions are superstition. If you've read Madison's Federalist Papers, he's clearly inspired by something like that too, right? So guided by knowledge, but you don't want to make everybody into scientists or philosophers. That's impossible. And as he says, if those principles coincide and act in the same direction, the leader's vision and people's opinions, the game of human society would go on easily and harmoniously and is very likely to be happy and successful. Right? This is the optimist in Smith. Right? So a good leader must make his vision coincide with the individual emotions and opinions of the people. To put this in contemporary jargon, governments with the grain of society will likely be successful, and the underlying vision is ameliorative. You're not going to try to create a heaven on earth, but you're going to try to improve society gradually and over time. That's again, a very common Enlightenment ideal. And that, I think, becomes very clear in this passage. When the statesman cannot conquer the rooted prejudices of the people by reason and persuasion, he will not attempt to subdue them by force. He will accommodate as well as he can his public arrangements to the confirmed habits and prejudices of the people. Right? Smith is an elitist, there's no doubt about that. And will remedy as well as he can the inconveniences which may flow from the want of those regulations which the people are averse to submit to. When he cannot establish the right, he will not disdain to ameliorate the wrong. But like Solon, when he cannot establish the best system of laws, Solon is a famous Greek legislator, he will endeavor to establish the best that the people can bear. Right? So this is a reformist vision. And you don't try to change the people at once. You try to work with their beliefs and views, and you take the country along, as it were, to a better place. So a Smithian leader governs through reason and persuasion, abhors violence, doesn't expect to turn citizens into philosophers, scientists, and while he doesn't flatter the people, he tries to work with their views in order to ameliorate bad consequences. And since any society we live in is imperfect, there's always something to do. Right? There's no moment in time have we lived in a utopia. Okay, I'll come back to Smith's own views on leadership at the end, but I think we get a better sense of what he's after if we look at the three kinds of bad leadership that is in his text. So the first one is he has a true dislike for what we might call arrogant and decisive leaders. And he thinks that always leads to ruin, and there's a lot of self-deception involved. The second he dislikes are ideological fanatics, who also, like Smith, have a vision for society, but think that you can implement the vision with violence or with just a part of the people in charge. And then the third one he dislikes are what in the 18th century called our factional leaders. We would probably say partisanship, right? And I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so first the bad leaders. To insist upon establishing at all at once, and in spite of all opposition, everything which that idea may seem to require, must often be the highest degree of arrogance. It is to erect his own judgment in the supreme standard of right and wrong, right, the leader's judgment. It is to fancy himself the only wise and worthy man in the commonwealth, and that his fellow citizens should accommodate themselves to him, and not he to them. And then he starts describing the kind of psychology of such leaders, and this arrogance is, and the class of people that belongs to them, this arrogance is perfectly familiar to them. They entertain no doubt of the immense superiority of their own judgment. That should remind you of somebody. They seldom see anything so wrong in it as the obstructions which it may sometimes oppose to execution of their own will. Right? So, for Smith, you're a bad leader if you think of yourself as the smartest person around. Right? Then something has gone wrong. He also thinks you're a bad leader, and this is interesting if you look at business magazines. If you think of yourself as decisive. Decisive leaders tend to be overconfident and make mistakes, on his view. And they're not acting for reason and persuasion, but try to show that they can get things done. Right? And for Smith, that's a real character flaw. Another character flaw is if you're a leader that hates constitutional obstructions. If you can't handle the slowness of government, if you want to get things done speedily, you're likely to make colossal and dangerous mistakes. Right? The other thing that's really key about the passage is the leader that embraces unitary authority. Right? So if you don't like divided government, if you don't like opposition, if you think that the very possibility of a check on you is a problem, you're likely to be an arrogant and, in the end, flawed leader on his view. And also, although this is not explicit, but I think is kind of implied by the text, this kind of leader hates compromise. Why should you compromise if you know better? Right? So this is a type, and Smith spends quite a bit of time discussing this kind of bad leadership. In context, the people who are these are either princes or those with inherited wealth. Right? I almost put a picture of Donald Trump on the slide just to get the character in thing, but I thought, who knows who is in the audience today? Shouldn't cause trouble. Okay. Now comes a more complicated sort of bad leadership. And the reason it's complicated is because this kind of leadership is very close to the kind of leadership that Smith endorses. And so I'm first going to discuss the mechanism that I think Smith also wants to appeal to, and then describe how it goes wrong. So the same principle, the same love of system, the same regard to the beauty of order, of art and contrivance, frequently serves to recommend those institutions which tend to promote the public welfare. Right? So we have intellectual visions of society, and those visions are for the good of the people, and those visions are beautiful. They can be elegant system of equations, they can be a utopian plan, they can be a vision statement. Now, when a patriot exerts himself for the improvement of any part of the public police, his conduct does not always arise from pure sympathy with the happiness of those who are to reap the benefit of it. Not all do-gooders do good because they like the people they want to help. They have different motives. And it's not commonly from a fellow feeling with carriers and wagoners that a public-spirited man encourages the mending of high roads. The perfection of police, that just means policy, not policing. The extension of trade and manufacturers are noble and magnificent objects. Right? This is a good thing to do. Wanting to help society is noble and magnificent. The contemplation of them pleases us, and we're interested in whatever we can tend to advance them. They make part of the great system of government, and the wheels of the political machine seem to move with more harmony and ease by means of them. We take pleasure in beholding the perfection of so beautiful and grand a system, and we are uneasy till we remove any obstruction that can in the least disturb or encumber the regularity of its motions. If you're a public policy nerd, then improving public policy will strike you as one of the most beautiful things you can imagine. Right? If you're public-spirited, you may also have a similar aesthetic impulse. All constitutions of government, however, are valued only in proportion as they tend to promote the happiness of those who live under them. Right? The same year as the Declaration of Independence, happiness is in the air. Right? I thought that was a good joke. I take it back. Joking in a different language than the one I teach you is really a bad mistake. This is their sole use and end. From a certain spirit of system, however, from a certain love of art and contrivance, we sometimes seem to value the means more than the end, and to be eager to promote the happiness of our fellow creatures, rather from a view to perfect and improve a certain beautiful and orderly system, than from any immediate sense or feeling of what they either suffer or enjoy. There have been men of the greatest public spirit who've shown themselves in other respects not very sensible to the feelings of humanity. People can be great benefactors to mankind while really not being very interested in other people. right? And what motivates them to be a great benefactor is this aesthetic sense of beauty that they can participate in constructing and making. I think it's for Smith, aesthetic motivation is very important. And that's key. Beauty or harmony motivates us to act, and this is not something Smith rejects. We improve things because we want to make the world more beautiful, not only because we want to do good or we want to help ourselves. That's other motives. But for Smith, we want to make things better. So crucially for Smith, imperfect motives can sometimes lead to good outcomes, right? That's his kind of a version of his invisible hand. But beauty is itself not a good justification. What really matters is the happiness of the people. Right, and this leads me into a kind of problem, and that is what Smith calls the spirit of system, commonly takes the direction of that more gentle public spirit. But sometimes, and it animates it, but often it inflames it even to the madness of fanaticism. So this aesthetic motive, while often very good, and in fact something to be nourished, can have an excess and can turn us into fanatics, right? And this is the kind of utopian project that wants to impose its aesthetic vision on society. Think of a certain form of Stalinism, if you want. So ideology, that's how I'm going to use the word system, could turn that doesn't work quite, could turn lovers of beauty into fanatics. And that means that even well-intended ideologies can end up producing really excessive lovers of beauty who turn into fanatics. Smith sometimes, actually in this quote too, uses the terminology of madness, drives people crazy. And the danger here is not their personal psychological health, but they're going to use violence on others to implement their vision. And whenever Smith talks about fanaticism, he's always in the context describing somebody who wants to either use personal violence or state violence to get their way. And whenever you use violence, on Smith's view, something bad will happen. And in fact, I mentioned to you already that our admiration for celebrities and billionaires is a source of corruption. The other form of corruption is fanaticism. Right? And what he has in mind, 5 minutes, perfect, is religious fanaticism. So Schliesser is right to say that politics can be a huge problem. She didn't get that wrong. Right? There is a real danger here. I'm going to skip the passage in the interest of time and just going to summarize it for you. What's crucial is that for Smith, there are two kinds of fanatics, religious and political ones. And they're especially dangerous when they have access to violence. And in fact, Smith's view of a heretic is just somebody who has less power than the authority, the leading church. And they're cohesive because they're basically echo chambers of mutual sympathy. Let me see if I have that passage. If I can, no, you have to believe me. And the problem with echo chambers is that they become partial rather than impartial. This is how our morality is corrupted, is because when we take our faction or our party or our church to be our reference point, we end up losing impartiality. And impartiality for Smith is crucial to morality. If you don't have that, you somehow end up being immoral. More important is they don't always respect truth and justice. And what's really awesome about the quote that I've skipped is that it turns out that partisanship works in part by the creation of theological justifications for their own behavior. It's a very interesting analysis. Problem is, if you're in a society where there are a lot of religious or political fanatics, it's very hard to be an independent on the sideline. Everybody wants you to join in, and you become itself part of the problem according to them. So he has an analysis of that too. Go skip that one too. Now, now maybe I should say a little bit here. The leader of the successful party, let me sum up for a second. 3 kinds of bad leaders. Leaders that are arrogant and self-conceited is the first. Leaders that have excessive love of beauty is the second. And leaders that turn into fanatics are the third, right? And that's a whole cluster of leadership that's extremely common and hasn't gone away. Having said that, I've given you evidence already that he thinks that in some circumstances, public spirit can lead to public good. Right? And in fact, even factional disputes can lead to good, because the leader of the successful party, if he has authority, I'm in the middle here, enough to prevail upon his own friends to act with proper temper and moderation, which he frequently has not, may sometimes render to his country a service more essential and important than the greatest victories in the most extensive conquest. He may re-establish and improve the Constitution, and from the very doubtful and ambiguous character of the leader of a party, he may assume the greatest and noblest of all characters, that of the reformer and legislator of a great state. Notice the phraseology. The best kind of person that exists is the person who puts the state on the right footing. Right? So this is not an anti-politics. This is getting the politics right politics. And by the wisdom of his institutions, secure the internal tranquility and happiness of his fellow citizens for many succeeding generations. Right? So if you're a unifier, if you know how to moderate, and if you manage to reform the Constitution such that it serves people's needs, you're the best kind of politician. Right? I'm going to sum up because I don't want to take up more of your time. So let me collect the different strands together. So the public-spirited Smithian leader is guided by knowledge, right, by system, has an ambitious vision that appeals to his own vanity and honor and perhaps sense of beauty, but that indirectly must serve the people and must make them happy. Right, that's key. And this relies on good judgment. That leader must be collaborative, must work well together with others, must be a gradualist, must respect the process, and also must respect the starting point of any given society. Right? The danger, of course, is that this turns into an excuse for conservatism and do-nothingness. Right? That's the temptation here. But for Smith, there always has to be a way to take the imperfect starting point and try to improve it. And this is even so when he argues for free trade. He's actually a critic of shock therapy, because even there, when you introduce free trade, he advocates gradualism and the implementation of policies very cautiously and slowly on grounds of humanity and fear of disorder, right? And the fear of disorder is both a moral concern and a political concern. When you try to do things too fast, you generate disorders, and that can lead to revolution, or it can lead to riots or other stuff, or it can lead to people going hungry without you having taken provisions. All of that a good leader needs to plan carefully for. And let me stop there.
So my question was regarding...
Wait, what's your name?
Brett.
Nice to meet you, Brett.
Nice to meet you. So my question was regarding, I take your point that he didn't want to turn citizens into philosophers or scientists, but there seems to be a passage in Wealth of Nations that suggests that he was worried about the ignorance that would come from division of labor. So I guess how would he reconcile that problem, and how would he sort of formulate a solution for it, especially if the people didn't want a solution to it?
Okay, great. Brett is going to keep me honest today. So So the question is, I say, look, he doesn't want to turn people into philosophers. But here's in fact a famous passage in Book 5 of Wealth of Nations where Smith talks about the division of labor and the fact that if you have to do the same job day in, day out, that's unchallenging in various ways, it makes you more stupid. Language he uses is torpor of mind, but there's a danger that certain kind of economic activities make us less intellectual and less well-equipped, right? And that seems to be a real problem, both morally and politically. And that's right. And moreover, I said that, and it allows me to say something more precisely. I said that Smith doesn't like anarchism because of the moral problems it generates of famine and hunger, and we do infanticide more likely. We leave the elderly to die in savage societies. But I also wanted to be very careful that he also thinks that the savage person has many more intellectual challenges and is in many ways more interesting and smarter than a civilized human being, right? So for Smith, moral and political advance, there's always a loss as well. And that's, you put your finger on precisely that issue. So one of the things I put in there in passing is that Smith does believe that good government has to provide for education. And his system is a mixture of private and public. So subsidized education for the working poor. The rich, they have to pay most of their own education, and in those days that meant sending them to France and Italy on a grand tour and probably debauching themselves in various ways. He also thought there should be subsidies and prizes so that kids would improve themselves. And I think, but what he's addressing in these passages is not just creating a human capital so that we create better workers, but to address the problem that you've put your finger on, namely we need people to exercise good judgment, and we need citizens to exercise good judgment, and education is a way to get there. Not the only way, but it is a very important way. So if you have an economy that makes people dumber, a public-spirited statesman or stateswoman has to create institutions that compensates that, both for the good for the economy, but more important for the good for the polity, right? Now Smith wrote, Smith was Scottish, and in Scottish there was near universal literacy, boys and girls at this point, whereas in England there was very little literacy. So his reform projects are really in part taking the Scottish model and suggesting to the English, you've got something to learn from us. But I think you're right. Now, it's not, I've mentioned economics and politics, but I also think that he believes that education is important for our individual moral development and our personal happiness. Because I've already pointed out to you that he thinks that aesthetics, beauty is something important, an important motivational pull. But to appreciate beauty doesn't come by itself in his view. That needs to be cultivated too. Right? So there are a whole set of issues that education does for Smith. Some of them narrowly economic or even narrowly political, others more diffuse. And the kind of education he proposes for the young, it's very interesting. He wants kids to read literature and learn geometry. Right? This is a liberal arts education he's promoting for young kids. Right? So in that sense, I think that's a very important topic. You should do research on Adam Smith and education. You'll find many more things to say.
There was a question over this direction.
My name is Krzysztof, and I have a question regarding this admiration of rich people and celebrities. One can look and think if these thoughts of Adam Smith that these are both good and bad, if both of the thought that it causes corruption as well as the thought that this actually solidifies and creates the social structure. If both of these are correct, or only one is correct, or maybe they are both incorrect. But regardless of that, actually, maybe it's not how it has to be, that there is this admiration, there is this respect, maybe this respect and admiration for very rich people, for millionaires and celebrities. It is not necessary to exist in the society. And if that would be the case, would the result be anarchy in when we look at the thought of Adam Smith?
Okay. So correct me if I don't understand your question, but I'm going to try to rephrase it, and if you think I'm not being fair to you, interrupt me. So I think you're raising at least two interesting issues. One is the issue, look, Smith seems to be making an empirical claim about human social psychology. How has that stood the test of time? Right? Are we really naturally disposed to admire and the powerful and rich and the celebrities? And does that really cause moral corruption? Right? That's the empirical claim. And then the second issue you put on the table is whether or not we can think of an anarchic society where there really is nobody to admire, such that the mechanism doesn't, at least celebrity and rich people, such that the mechanism doesn't have to do its work. Is that right?
More or less.
Okay, good. Let me say something about the second one. Because that's a kind of counterfactual, and I'm a philosopher, and I kind of like counterfactuals. I think Godwin, the husband of husband? Yeah, but they were married, right? Yeah, well, they didn't. They got married. Yeah, of Wollstonecraft, he produced a book. What's it called?
Political justice.
Thank you. It's a test of you, Ross. That really is a kind of working
That's
out.
a Malthus question.
Which is about this question, right? It's asking us to think of an anarchic egalitarian society, right? And that inspired many 19th century what we now call utopian movements, Owen, Fourier, etc. So there have been living experiments in this ideal, and depending on your judgment, those work well on small scales. Israeli kibbutzes are sometimes thought of, but tend to scale up badly. If you take a very skeptical interpretation of these experiments, it looks like even in those groups, there are always charismatic leaders who get them going. There's infighting over who gets more attention or not. So I'm not entirely convinced that the counterfactual is really a workable thing. But at the same time, in the spirit of humility, we should keep an open mind on that. I think that's an empirical question itself, what the ways in which human nature can be expressed or not. I teach a course on utopian thought, and I constantly am amazed by what people can dream up. And maybe under the right circumstances, this mechanism need not happen, right? But the track record is in Smith's favor, I think.
Actually, there is a question of what kind of people and what kind of celebrities we ought to respect, we can respect.
That's the first question.
And
I'll get to that. Good. So, and this ties your question with, what's your name? Christoph. Brad Christoph. So there's a connection between the two. Smith has a line that is my favorite line that I'll misinterpret and misremember, but my favorite line in Smith, which is something like, the true secret of education is to orient vanity to its proper objects. Right? I hope I got that. Somebody know there's Smith? I think that's more or less what he says. It's in my book somewhere. the danger with the internet is people can look things up at once, and the bluffing and name dropping doesn't work anymore the way it used to. But that gets to your point, right? If you can design mechanisms that get us to admire the right kind of things, you might have hope to undermine the mechanism we're worried about. I'm not optimistic. I think celebrities are doing quite well for themselves, and the rich people are doing quite well for themselves to get our attention. And it's not clear to me what that vanity and other mechanisms will counterbalance well enough. But having said that, there's also a matter of degree, right? We can live in cultures and environments where interesting people get more attention than they have now, right? I mean, I think that you don't have to take the status quo as given, but I think that Smith probably gotten on to something that is quite enduring. And I'll say that one last thing on that. When he's writing, he's really thinking about feudalism, right? Great lords and their hangers-on. What's interesting is that feudalism, in his sense, has disappeared, but this mechanism has really endured. Right? So that makes me think he's onto something, sadly.
Hello, my name is Ben. You said that one of his points for a bad leader was decisiveness. Now, does he see no value in being decisive on things, or is he more talking about someone who says, "I've made up my mind, I don't want to listen to any other opinions"?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I was being deliberately excessive there, perhaps. But you know, Smith and his buddies, these Enlightenment thinkers, they had their attention on centuries of development. Right? They're really looking at developments of hundreds of years, even millennia. And from that perspective, what a particular politician decides or doesn't decide to do will seem less weighty than the politician's articulation of the decision. Right? So I think his tendency is always to discount the significance of it. Now, there are circumstances, a general, for instance, who has to be decisive, right? So the virtue of decisiveness is not rejected in all parts of life. Perhaps a business person has to be decisive in some context, right? If you're trying to save a drowning kid, you better be decisive, right? So I don't mean to suggest that he's always against decisiveness, but a politician who prides himself on decisiveness is somebody you should be cautious about. I think that's maybe a more subtle way of saying it. Did I take away your concern now, or is it still there? That makes sense. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nick.
Hi, Nick.
So I'll try to formulate this question. But so you were saying that Smith cares more about a leader who cares about the happiness of the people rather than trying to push forward some ideological vision. And so my question is, what do you think Smith would say, how do you think Smith would say that you could achieve the happiness of a person? So would it be through economic achievement or material gain, or would it be through more of an Aristotelian idea of building up virtues or virtuous habits? And if it is the latter, how would you say that Smith would say that you institute virtuous habits in an individual?
Are you a student here too?
Yeah.
Jesus, you guys are good. Okay, Nick? But there's two questions here too, right? So the first question is about what a leader aims at and whether that's happiness. And the second question is the relationship between, let's call it, economic growth and the development of virtue. Is that fair? Okay, good. So on the first question, Smith has wants it both ways. Our evaluation of the goodness of a leader has to be, in the end, in part, did the state survive? Is there public tranquility? And are the people happy? Right? That's the criterion by which we judge their outcomes. So when it comes to institutions and public life, Smith is a consequentialist. And are there good consequences, then we should endorse them. But when it comes to the intentions of the leader, what Smith points out is that it's okay if the intentions aren't really aimed at people's happiness. The intentions can be at beauty or perfection or even vanity of some sorts, as long as they operate in such a way such that these good outcomes also follow. One of my own claims about Smith is that in some ways he's inspired by Machiavelli, actually, and he's much more realist. What he sees is a political class in Great Britain that likes imperial conquest, and on the one hand, and you've got these great landowners who are really not doing enough on his view. And what he wants to say is, if you have the right sort of ambition, you can make a name for yourself as a politician, and if your vision pays off properly, people will be happy, right? But what the content of that vision is, that could be quite a bit, and I didn't say much about that today. In the book when I wrote the book, I was aware of this part, not the statesmanship part, so there's quite a bit there. So now let me get to your second point. So a key empirical claim that Smith makes, and this is kind of thought you had in mind, is that when there is economic growth and unemployment goes down, the conditions of flourishing are present. Right? He really uses the terminology of flourishing and not just the terminology of happiness. Right? And he thinks that in conditions of peace and in conditions of flourishing, the moral virtues will develop. Right? It will require education and theater and other institutions, also the right kind of religion, right kind of family relations. It's a whole project. But economic growth is one of the necessary conditions for a flourishing society at large. Right? So he doesn't see a contradiction between economic growth and the developing of the virtues. On the contrary, he thinks economic growth is a precondition for the development of the virtues. Now, some of that's a reinterpretation of some of the virtues. Right? In many ways, he's closer to Aristotle than to Aquinas. And Cicero, but it's also a reinterpretation of that. If you have me back in a year or two, we'll have that conversation. I'll be better prepared for the answer.
We have time for one more question. Somebody want to take it?
Has it been just boys asking questions?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'll make space for my...
Are you sure none of you ladies
Yeah, I'm
want to
shaming
ask?
him now into giving up the... What would the impartial spectator say?
Yeah, I'll hand the mic over.
I'll hang around.
Do you have a question? Ask it.
So
What's your name? Sorry.
my name is Maggie,
Nice to meet you.
and this is kind of a joint question
Good.
that we've been discussing.
Shared
So
responsibility.
two women. So from the presentation, it seems like Smith was more in the camp of slow, gradual change to prevent a societal disruption.
Yeah.
So then what would he do if there was a time where there was no time for gradual change?
Yes, so that's the question about decisiveness in part. So, so his friend David Hume has a very clear answer to that. I'm going to take a detour and try to think what Smith's answer is by first telling you Hume's answer. Hume thinks there are going to be states of emergency, and in those contexts, you create temporary dictators. Right? It's a very Roman approach. The mechanism by which you create a temporary dictator turns out to look a lot like the election of an American president. right? So think of a president with quite expansive powers, that then the checks come after the fact, right? That's Hume's solution. He offers that of a perfect commonwealth. And what's interesting about it is it's a reflection on the failure of the Dutch great political leader Johan de Witt, who had been a great mathematician and a great statesman in the Dutch Golden Age, and who saved the Dutch from attack from the British and the French, and who did precisely that. In times of need, he took decisive action, even against the law. De Witt doesn't end well. He gets murdered and slaughtered and even eaten by the very Dutch people he saved. Right, the richest country in the world, and there's cannibalism, right? So it's the savage is in us. I love that episode for that reason. Smith conspicuously is not interested in that solution, right? So that tells us, I think, that he is he's disinclined to want to find exceptions under which you then institute decisive leadership. I think what he thinks is that good leadership takes a lot of precautionary principles. He also is writing, and I think this is key, really from the perspective of Great Britain, which at the time is basically militarily unassailable. Right? They're becoming the superpower of the world. And he might have thought that, and even in some of the passages, he used the terminology of a great nation. Right? He might have thought that, in fact, there are, in the conditions of his time, no such emergencies really going to arise. Right? And that's an empirical question. No, I don't think I know of a good case where he thinks, situation is so bad, let's remove. And what he does think is that there are going to be circumstances where things are bad, and then you just have to hope that the right kind of leadership is around to do the right thing, right? And that may, right? So there are two places where you might feel uneasy. If you have a temperament that thinks gradualism, boring, that's for middle-aged people who are risk-averse, right? The problems are really much too big for that, right? That's one very natural reaction. And the other is, well, look, occasionally we really need this decisive action, then indeed Smith is also not the person for you. On the second, I think there's a good response. Almost never are the circumstances such that you really need a dictator, right? I think we really should resist, which is really all-consuming. If you read, in one of my papers, I went through the psychological literature on business leadership, and it's unbelievable how much they love decisive leaders, right? But if you're dealing with complex organizations, the skills you really need are facilitation, are bringing people together, about listening, about collegiality, about giving respect, learning the names of the people you're interacting with. These are, I think, much more important, even in cases where the whole world is screaming decisiveness, decisiveness. So I think on the second, I'd really be willing to push back. On the first charge, that he's a bit of a boring gradualist, I think you have a point. Oh yeah, now you have to give the microphone back.
Thank you. We're going to let's thank Eric for being here and talking to us.